Donagakgia, Abwashtet, Tanse. Hello, good day to everyone. My name is Rebecca Sockbeson. I'm of the Penobscot Indian Nation. My home community here in Alberta is the Alexis First Nations. I am the Associate Director of Intersections of Gender, Office of the Vice President for Research and Innovations Signature Areas. And I'm also an Associate Professor in the Faculty of Education in Indigenous Peoples Education Graduate Specialization here at the University of Alberta. The title of my talk today is Red Hope, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls and Indigenous Healing Through Feminist Action. And I want to give special thanks to International Week 2021 for inviting me to spend this time with you today to talk to you about these critical issues. I'm going to start off today with a dedication and an honoring to my late niece, Jacqueline Bruno. And this is a memorial art that went on a memorial round dance that we had for her. And she passed away untimely in 2010 and was still yet a teenager upon her passing. And the family continues to grieve her loss and not know of, there are a lot of unanswered questions about her death, and may she rest peacefully. So for Jacqueline Bruno, lots of love to you. I'm going to start out with a creative expression of impact for the day today, and it's both a prayer and an honoring for and of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And I will start off the spoken word piece that I wrote. And, parts of this poem are in the concrete in front of the post office downtown. And I want to share this with you in this way to not only set a tone, but to also give thanks and gratitude and honor for those who are not able to be with us today. And so the beginning of the spoken word starts with where I come from back home in the Wabanaki Confederacy of Tribes in the northeast of the United States and the Maritimes in Canada. The Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, Bunawabskig, Penobscot, and Passamaquoddy, and Abenaki peoples is where I come from. And this song is known as the Turtle Song. And it was Mugalid Paul, who is from the Wabanaki Confederacy of Tribes, shared the song with us when I was a teenager myself. And that song has traveled out west here and is known as the Strong Woman Song. So I've integrated it into the spoken word. And so, please join me in thinking about and offering, love and blessings and healing light to the families missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And it goes like this. A message to the ones who stole my Native sisters, and to the systems and the leaders whose inaction contributes to this genocide, to the police who turned their backs or acted out their toxic, masculine, violent white supremacy on her, to the Prime Minister who halted the national inquiry into the whereabouts of countless Native sisters, and to the next Prime Minister who reinstated the inquiry and has been too slow to take action, to the unjustice system that allows her to stay invisible, raped, exploited, and dehumanized. This is race-based genocide, legalized and silenced. Over 2,000 stolen sisters unaccounted for. That's proportionately equivalent to at least 35,000 non-Native sisters. The country, Canada, would be in an uproar if 35,000 white sisters went missing. That nears the student population here at the University of Alberta and many rural towns. Aboriginal sisters are 7 to 10 times more likely to be murdered than your sisters. What if she was your niece, your daughter, your auntie, your mother, or your sister? What if you were socialized and taught to see her as your sister too? I close my eyes and I imagine, what if there was no need for an inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls? Sipsis, Barnawupskig elder, once told a group of us women, we think of white people every day, and they don't ever have to think or consider us. Missing and murdered meets honored and thriving. Will I live to see this every day when I can say we are thriving, respected, cherished, and honored by this society? Today, the recording in my mind is that we are invisible survivors, demanding justice, praying, sweating, singing, dancing, weaving, and beating for moments and sustained times of thriving. Red hopefulness found in Native sisters marching, organizing, and standing up, claiming, expecting, and welcoming the bright light of thriving. Many of us are still here for the ones who aren't. Genocide is not complete. Every time we speak out, stand up, talk back, we thrive. We live out who our ancestors prayed for us to be. So we'll get into the nuts and bolts of the presentation. Ready to start now. So in my gratitude to International Week for the opportunity to talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women and the report on the inquiry, I was invited to consider the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 5, which is looking to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls internationally. And we know that especially since the pandemic, Indigenous women and girls and women and girls internationally have felt the impacts of the pandemic in disproportionate ways. We know that in some countries, the rate of violence against women and girls has increased 30%. So when we are considering Indigenous women and girls who are already disproportionately impacted by violence, that an added 30% on top of that during a pandemic, makes these numbers even more inequitable and disproportionate. So that's sort of the caveat that I will be speaking from today. So I want to provide some brief historical context because one of the big takeaways upon reading the report on the National Inquiry of 2019, as I engaged with this document, in my research and in preparation for this talk, one of the main takeaways is that the commission for the inquiry names what has been happening, what continues to happen in explaining MMIWG as a genocide, and so which has been an area of contention within Canadian society, so that it's I think a really subjugated, sort of a hidden concept within Aboriginal history. And this is part of what I do as a scholar, as I've studied quite at length genocide of Indigenous peoples, my people in particular, and historical and contemporarily. So I want to show you the beginning, the first era of policy against Indigenous peoples in North America, which were these bounties on Indigenous people's scalps and live bodies. And so you can see in this bounty that where scalping comes from. So it's a 1755 colonial document that has never been eradicated or apologized for. And my doctoral research engaged in the analysis of this document, and I published that in 2000. I published my first academic article doing analysis of this document in 2008, which marked the first time a Wabanaki scholar or person had done a publication in the analysis of this document. So from 1755 to 2005, there's very little knowledge and understanding around even the existence of this document. Okay, so typically the majority of people are, and rightfully so, they're familiar with the Holocaust and the Nazi Holocaust. And whereas in Canada, the United States, the average person isn't as aware of, this genocide that I'm going to talk to you about today. And as there's also a stereotype in the media that scalping comes from Indigenous peoples, but it certainly doesn't. And this is, part of that, empirical evidence that to see where scalping comes from. And so the compensation for a man in 1755 was 50 pounds. And in today's sort of ratio, market ratio, that would be around equivalent to about $40,000. And women, their scalps were worth half the amount, and children equal to women. So I wanted to just share this document with you because you can see where the genocide begins and how heavily hidden it is, and subjugated. Subjugated is just hidden, right? So as I did the analysis of this document, I also keep with me this cherished image of my late great-grandma, Elizabeth Andrews. And she would have been the first generation to have fled and escaped, this bounty. And so I want to quote here and I want to share with you some Wabanaki woman knowledge. Late Mary Bassett, Passamaquoddy elder, would remind us quite often that although we're not supposed to be here, we are still here. And we often hear, even throughout, when we hear about MMIWG or other, major, issues within society that Indigenous peoples face, like the 60 Scoop, the Indian residential school system, and the legacy of those, and the legacy of the Indian Act. We hear this word intergenerational trauma, which is very much a reality. And at the same time, my work calls for a deeper tribal critical race analysis, that Brian Brayboy introduced into the literature, which requires us to understand that surely intergenerational trauma is real, and at the same time, we need to understand in a deeper way that we are surviving systems of colonial oppression that continue to perpetuate genocide. And so a critical reminder, in this process, and something, just a thought I would like you to resonate or to think about as I move through, all of this information, is that missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls was not a reality before colonization. And it is one of the major crises that we face as Indigenous peoples today. So this is also, the bounty that I showed you is not just a U.S. thing. Didn't just happen down in the United States. It actually happened all along the seaboard, the eastern seaboard. So this was a reality in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick as well. And here, is a citation and a reference to that. In that historical context, I want to share with you a contemporary context of how genocide is celebrated and how that bounty is normalized, or genocide and colonial oppression becomes widely accepted, in society. I've written and published at length about this experience, so I'm going to be very brief about it, given the time frame that we have today. But this is a picture of my daughter when she was in kindergarten, and she was going to a school where she had received this card, this reading buddies card, from her fourth grade reading buddy. And as you can see on the left side of the card, the colonial ship is bombing the Indians on the shore. And I had taken this out of her school bag, and I asked her, to come sit with me and to take a look at it. And I asked her about it, and she had said, "Yeah, those are the bad pirates killing the Indians." And she had said, "They're playing this game at school too, Mama, at recess. And but I don't play because I'm a real Indian. But the kindergartners are the Indians, and the first graders are the pirates. But not all pirates are bad." And so she then turned to me and asked, why do they want to kill us? And she concluded, "I think it's because they don't know enough about us." And so I then took, measures to go into the school, work with the headmaster and the classroom, and explain to the children that at one time this was a for real game, and that if they play this game at recess, it hurts us. And, children are really exceptional critical thinkers, and they were, very responsive, and made a commitment in that, in that roundup sort of circle with them, that they would never, play that game again because they didn't want to hurt their friend. So this is how these images just are very much, normalized in Canadian society. And for many of us in my generation, we were experiencing the same thing: kill the Indian at recess, or Indian germs. And it celebrates, a genocidal, history against our peoples, and it becomes very normalized. So I wanted to just start off explaining that story, because it also humanizes the following statistics that I want to share with you. And so part of the work that I do is a dedication to mobilizing, the truth of Indigenous girls, women, in an effort to humanize the statistics. And so that, stories and real life experiences are associated with some of the statistics, and that part of my work is also very much dedicated to reinforcing the reality that we are so much more than the statistics. So I'm just going to rattle, these off, because they also, frame the impetus for why a national inquiry was struck. Okay. So as Indigenous women and girls, we are more impoverished than any other demographic group, highest rates of socioeconomic distress of any racial or ethnic group in Canada or the United States. Almost half of Aboriginal women are living in poverty. They're the least likely to be homeowners in our homelands. The highest suicide rates of any population group in the country, up to 7 times more likely to commit suicide than white people, more likely to attempt suicide than Native men, but our men are 4 times more likely to, quote, succeed in their suicide attempts. Native women in North America are 10 times more likely to be victims of violence than non-Native women. Because the majority of suicides are committed by young people, mothers grieving their children's untimely deaths are secondary victims. And so those statistics are important to understand the significance and the importance for the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls in 2019, which the report was released then. And the name of the report is Reclaiming Power and Place, the final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. And so after 3 years of work, beginning in September 2016, more than 2,380 people participated in the National Inquiry. And commissioners reflect and report that wasn't even enough time, that they would have, liked a lot more time to be able to hear more people. 468 family members and survivors of violence shared their experiences and recommendations at 15 different community hearings across the nation. The brilliantly written research and evidence-based report is 1,200 pages long with a 121 page executive summary, and this is all online. And so I have provided links in my references page for anyone to be able to log on and take a look at it. So a lot of my presentation is actually extrapolating, quotes from the report and sharing with you what I felt were some real significant takeaways and heightened understandings for myself. And so I quote from the report: colonial violence, as well as racism, sexism, homophobia, and transphobia against Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, and asexual people, has become embedded in everyday life. Whether this is through interpersonal forms of violence, through institutions like the healthcare system and the justice system, or in the laws, policies, and structures of Canadian society. So, in other words, colonial violence, and when the report names racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and they are identifying how that has become embedded in everyday life, whether it's through interpersonal forms of violence, like the recess game that I just explained to you, or through institutions like the healthcare system. So in the healthcare system, we know that Indigenous peoples in emergency rooms are triaged slower and tended to at a slower rate than non-Indigenous peoples, is just one example of many. In the justice system, that has a disproportionate amount of Aboriginal peoples in the prisons. Some prisons are 80 to 90% Aboriginal peoples. And laws that have been legislated against us in order to address us as a problem, imposing our identities and taking lands, putting, Indian residential school system was legislated. The 60s scoop was legislated. So, and policies and structures of Canadian society. So the result of all of that has been that many Indigenous peoples have grown up normalized to violence, while Canadian society shows an appalling apathy to addressing the issue. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls finds that this equals and amounts to genocide. Okay, and so that understanding it for what it is really important in being able to move forward and address the issue properly. Okay, so as the Associate Director of Intersections of Gender, I want to also highlight the significance of intersectionality, in the report, and that the The report identifies the importance of engaging with the findings and the testimonials through an intersectional lens that recognizes, I quote, that a person's experience will be different than in others based on their particular interplay of race, ethnicity, indigeneity, gender, class, sexuality, geography, age, and ability, as well as how these intersections encourage systems of oppression and ultimately target Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit LGBTQIA people. Okay, so for Indigenous peoples in particular, using an intersectional approach requires understanding how a history of colonization has shaped their experiences today in order to make sense of why do we face such high MMIWG numbers. Okay, so intersectionality is key in the analysis of this work. Okay, and I'm going to lay out how the how the report is organized, and in unpacking the why are the numbers so high? Okay, because that was one of the mandates by the government for the commission, was to really explain why this is the way it is right now, right? And so I quote, in their testimonies, Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit LGBTQIA people argued that oppression against them is primarily based on colonialism, racism, and gender, with other factors such as education, income, and ability sometimes come into play. So in particular, families and survivors consistently referred to four general ways, and in the report they're called pathways, that their experiences were rooted in colonialism, across First Nations, Métis, and Inuit perspectives, as well as from their perspectives as sexual minorities. So the pathways are the following. So the pathways that maintain colonial violence, okay, that's key to understand. The pathways that maintain colonial violence are historical, multi-generational, and intergenerational trauma, social and economic marginalization, maintaining the status quo, and institutional lack of will. So when institutions lack the political will to do the right thing, and to comply, with something like the recommendations out of either the TRC or now the inquiry on MMIWG, excuse me. So as witnesses shared, the more these four pathways intersect in an Indigenous person's life, the more likely they are to experience violence. So, for example, if an Indigenous person is a sexual minority, and they have also grown up in poverty, which is very likely, according like the statistics that I shared, Indigenous women are, at least half of Indigenous women are living in poverty. And if they are also surviving historical, multi-general, intergenerational trauma, so if they themselves are Indian residential school survivors or a 60 scoop survivor, then their likelihood of experiencing violence is extremely high. And all of those pathways that that person may have experienced, especially the pathway that was the cause of Canadian government legislation, like the Indian residential schools, the 60 scoop, okay, land dispossession, which has created poverty, okay, increases their likelihood to experience violence. Okay, and this is what constitutes and why they, why we, I say they, but I agree, why it is identified as genocide, because there's an intention to eradicate a group of people here. Okay. And so the report highlights that thousands of truths shared before the national inquiry reinforce the existence of these acts of genocide. And the violence the national inquiry heard about amounts to race-based genocide of Indigenous peoples. So the genocide has been empowered by those colonial structures, that I have briefly covered. Evidenced notably by the Indian Act. So I'll talk a little bit more about the Indian Act in a little bit, and of course the 60 scoop, Indian residential schools, and breaches of human and Indigenous rights, leading directly to the current increased rates of violence, death, and suicide in Indigenous populations. So, in the report, there is a supplementary um, part of the report that offers some really brilliant legal analysis and discussion supporting the conclusions around genocide. So there's a special, part of the report that does this legal analysis, and I would encourage, individuals that are still not clear, after this talk, to please go in and read that. So I want to just keep interjecting here the reminder that the intergenerational trauma is a reality, okay? But a deeper tribal critical race analysis requires us to understand that we are surviving genocide, so that there's oftentimes deficit approaches to thinking about Indigenous peoples, like, well, it's just their intergenerational trauma, and that's why they have all of these problems. Okay. And oftentimes there is a tendency to not look at, oh, well, actually, there's been systems of oppression and colonial violence that has created the intergenerational trauma. So a deeper tribal critical race analysis would say, well, yeah, there's intergenerational trauma, but it's equally, if not more important, to look at the surviving of genocide and the laws and policies that have created this situation. Okay. And I just want to give an example of the truths shared. Some of them, it is just heart-wrenching to read some of the stories of the families. And to be quite honest, I probably couldn't even emotionally get through this talk if I had to read some of them, because it's so close to home and close to my heart. But there's something that's synthesized at the beginning in the executive summary, and I quote, I'll just read out here. These fears are not unfounded. As expert witness Cassandra Churcher shared, the police and the criminal justice system exist in the lives of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit LGBTQIA people, not to provide safety and protection, but rather in a way that continues to traumatize, abuse, and control them. Lack of institutional will to change the criminal justice system manifests most clearly in the descriptions of police apathy in cases involving violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit LGBTQIA people that witnesses provided. So the witnesses in the testimonies shared an abundance of stories where they experienced police apathy. And a lack of institutional will to change the criminal justice system. And this apathy, the report says, often takes the form of stereotyping and victim blaming. So people reported, being, police describing missing loved ones as drunks, runaways out partying, or prostitutes unworthy of follow-up. And so the report has hundreds of interviews and testimonies that are well documented to make these sorts of synthesized conclusions. So I want to just take a moment to unpack institutional and systemic racism, because it's an important underpinning to get a handle of on as we move forward in the discussion. Indigenous peoples of North America are the most heavily, I said this earlier, the most heavily legislated against than any other group. We've got more laws and policies developed in order to deal with us as a problem than any other group. And at the same time, we have a trust or fiduciary relationship with the federal government, both in Canada and the United States. So a trust or a fiduciary relationship is the highest form of legal relationship that a government can have with a people. And that's certainly what distinguishes us as Indigenous peoples. And that's rooted in the Constitution. And so, while at the same time, the institutional and systemic racism is manifested and is sort of really clear in how we have been legislated against. So, what many people don't realize is that the Indian residential school system was something that was legislated, that there were laws forcing children to go into these schools where they were, where there was, there were violent criminal acts against children. And the TRC reports, there were over 7,000 people interviewed in that commission and process. Of the over 150,000 children that went to Indian residential schools, there were 7,000 interviewed, and the overwhelming majority reported, experiencing criminal violence by these school systems, and they were forced to go there. So that was legislated, right? And so that is a way that racism gets institutionalized. Okay. So in the Indian Act, for instance, what many individuals don't realize is that it was a federal offense to practice our ceremonies, including potlatch and Sundance. Native people were barred from leaving reserves even without permission and prohibited from wearing ceremonial dress off reserve. So it wasn't, and that wasn't even amended until 1951. So for many of us in my generation, I'm 48 years old. My father-in-law, my mother was born in 1938, so she was, an adult when this, and my father-in-law similarly was an adult, from here, because my father-in-law is from my home community here in Alexis First Nation, and faced these realities, of not being able to leave the reserve after sundown, needing a ticket. And basically a permit that would get checked off by the Indian agent at the border of the reserve in order to be allowed in and out, right? And so there was just a lot of control on Indigenous peoples, and women in the Indian Act were and continue to be even more adversely impacted in terms of legal imposition of identity. Okay, and so, specific to gender inequality, the Indian Act systematically dispossessed Aboriginal women of their Indian status. Okay, so in turn, denying basic human rights and treaty rights. So, in effect, contributing to the increasing social reality of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So, exclusion from membership has historically and contemporarily meant the denial of treaty rights with associated access to land and key services related to education and health, which are inherent treaty rights. So Bill C has passed, and their women's application, many Indigenous women, their applications for Indian status have been pending for several years, even since Bill C-3 has been passed, which is supposed to, allow more Indigenous Aboriginal women access to their status. But even the process with the application has been tremendously slow. And for many have not even received word from the government, even though that was passed in 2017. Okay, so another highlight of the report is the guiding principle that is stated at the beginning. And this really gets at, when I talk about the important reminder that we are so much more than the socioeconomic distress and the colonial oppression, is that the guiding principle for the report and the analysis is that, quote, our women and girls are sacred. And so they state that this vision will help build the foundation upon which First Nations, Métis, and Inuit women, girls, and Two-Spirit LGBTQIA people will reclaim their power and place. And this is where, I shift a little bit, of the talk to this space. Because it's important to know that even with the TRC, I think the TRC had 94 calls to action that were released in June of 2016, that those two are legal imperatives, similar to this process, okay? The recommendations, which they identify in here as calls for justice, two are legal imperatives. They're not optional, okay? So the calls for justice arise from international and domestic human and Indigenous rights laws, including the Charter, the Constitution, and the Honor of the Crown. So Canada has a legal obligation to fully implement these calls for justice and to ensure Indigenous women and girls, and Two-Spirit LGBTQIA people live in dignity. And they, as they say, and I quote, "We demand a world within which First Nations, Inuit, and Métis families can raise their children with the same safety, security, and human rights that non-Indigenous families enjoy, along with full respect for the Indigenous and human rights of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis families." So the 231 calls for justice are organized in 3 different parts. And there's 19 themes. And I've just identified some of those themes here. And this is to make it relevant to the talk. One of the themes is the need for public education and greater public awareness of violence against Indigenous women and girls. Universities are solicited in the calls for justice to do what we're doing here today. And there is an opportunity for universities to interpret it as maybe even considering a compulsory course that teaches about the truth and the history and the contemporary legacies and issues that Indigenous peoples face today, which would include, certainly a thread of and a thematic that addresses MMIWG. Another theme that I just pulled was the need for law reform of discriminatory legislation. And so, although Bill C3 is increasing the pathways for Aboriginal women to gain their status, that needs to happen a lot quicker. And there's lots more to be said about that. So the need for federal, provincial, and territorial governments to publicly acknowledge and condemn violence against Indigenous women and girls, that's another theme. The need for more frequent and accessible transportation services to be made available to Indigenous women so they can get out of dangerous situations quickly. And so that is an ongoing issue. We know that Indigenous girls, teenagers of any group, are the last or the least likely to get their learners and their drivers. So, you think about that just as being a safety measure that, so many non-Indigenous young people who are, especially middle class, right, have got their learners and their drivers and their ability to have their parents help them buy a car. And so their ability to get out of a dangerous situation is much higher than their Indigenous peers, who are more likely to live in poverty, less access to get their learners, and certainly less access to have a car. So it's just operationally, it's really important to think through, like, what are the implications of some of this, right? Of unearned privileges that that many folks in Canadian society enjoy and don't have to think about, right? So the majority, the majority of the calls for justice are aimed at governments and institutions, including universities. On an individual level, however, there are several actions Canadians can take, including but not limited to, and I pulled these from the bottom article here that I've got a hyperlink here. It was a news article, but they pulled these out as being ones that everyday Canadians, anyone listening to this, can engage with. And the first is to denounce and speak out against violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit LGBTQIA people when you see it. To decolonize ourselves by learning the true history of Canada and Indigenous history in your local area. Ask yourselves, do you know what territories you're on? Do you know who the Indigenous peoples are of the territories that you live on? And what is the history of the relationship with those Indigenous peoples? Develop knowledge and read the final report. I've got the link here to the final report. And although the final report is in 2 volumes and it's 1,200 pages long, the executive summary is 121 pages, and it's all brilliantly written. And it is research and evidence-based. It's a very strong, scholarly contribution to Canadian society that deserves reading. using what you have learned and some of the resources suggested, become a strong ally. There's a whole ally page within the inquiry page that I've provided you with here. Help hold all governments accountable to act on the calls for justice. Everyone has the ability to write their MLA and ask what's being done. The commissioners came out a year from the release of the report last June and made a very strong statement that the Canadian government was not taking enough action to respond to the report. And that continues to be the issue. And with the pandemic, which has slowed everything down, many of the commissioners who have come out publicly are concerned that the pandemic is being used as an excuse to further delay this. So it's important to get in touch with your MLA and see what's being done. Okay, so I want to talk about heightened anti-racist conviction. This is a term that I've introduced into the literature, and my references can give you a stronger or a more thorough look at these as I briefly cover them. So I've talked about intergenerational trauma, and I've also want to make it really clear, and I draw on Barbara Thomas's work here, who has written a letter to her daughters. She's a white woman and writes a letter to her daughters, encouraging them to learn more about colonial oppression. And she reminds her daughters that they're not responsible for wrongs committed before they were born. And she says to them, quote, "But you can't escape the legacy of the wrongs. You need to understand some history in order to understand your current position in the world and other people's perceptions of you. And you are responsible for what you do now." And so it's important to understand that, a lot of what's in the report, how I relay the information of the report, maybe even my spoken word expression of impact from this issue that I shared at the beginning of the report is it's not to blame, current Canadians for what has happened, but and at the same, there's no buts about it. It is to encourage Canadians to understand and better understand the history that and the legacy of colonial oppression, and how indeed Canadian society today benefits from the dispossession of Indigenous peoples. And that's profound. And so, Barbara Thomas is trying to explain to her daughters, it's important to know history, and you're not to be blamed for it, but it's important to know it in order to understand where we stand today, and in order to identify the terms on which we can talk about this now. And so anti-racist conviction calls for the taking up of this difficult knowledge. And so Britzman talks about lovely knowledge versus difficult knowledge. And oftentimes, Canadian society and US is very taken up with and wanting to learn more about Indigenous knowledge and culture. And there's a seduction and tendency to, sort of either not want to look at, the hard history that Indigenous peoples have faced, which is the difficult knowledge, and to really talk about and engage critically with the reality of genocide. And so it's easier to talk about that people just have intergenerational trauma, and then to start the conversation there. But the discussion needs to start with the genocide. Okay. And so I draw on Tibetan scholar and philosopher Tulku, who says, trying to change the world without changing our minds is like trying to clean the dirty face in the mirror by scrubbing the glass. And, if we're not really looking at, the genocide, we're just, scrubbing, we're trying to, Canadian society is just trying to clean a dirty face by scrubbing the glass. Okay. And I think it's a really appropriate metaphor in this context. Late Rini Atian from my community is quoted, and I write about her, this quote quite a bit, but she says, "White people think we're like a convenience store. They like to come in and buy the candy and the M&Ms of our culture and spirituality and leave behind all the cleaning products like the oppression, colonialism, and racism." So I talk quite a bit in my work, in my scholarly work, about red hope and political will in the context of anti-racist conviction. And such change will require the political will of non-Indigenous peoples to meaningfully engage with the more difficult task of taking up Attian's cleaning products to address colonial oppression and racism. Also critical, equally as critical, is the acknowledgement of red hope that Indigenous peoples will continue to be the leaders in asserting our rights in order to effect social and political change. So red hope offers a bright horizon, reminding us that epistemicide, which is the intention to eradicate our ways of knowing and being, via the Indian Act, there was an intention there in the prohibition of our ceremonies, and through Indian Residential School, the prohibition of our languages, an intention to eradicate our ways of knowing and being is epistemicide. Epistemology is how do we know what we know, and how does that impact our ways of being in the world today? So through the Indian Act, it was legislated, that knowledge, Indigenous knowledge transfer was legally prohibited in 1876, and that wasn't amended until 1951. So epistemicide, and we know today we're still practicing our ceremonies and singing our songs. Like epistemicide was not successful totally. It has devastating impacts, but that's also evidenced in the inquiry and the commissioners maintaining the guiding principle that women are sacred. Indigenous women are sacred, and that's the guiding principle. And so, and also, genocide is not complete, and that is the red hope that offers that bright horizon, reminding us that they are not complete. So I just wanted to end by showing you a few pictures, to show you that epistemicide, that genocide is not complete. This is this is Grandma Helen, my son's great grandma, who was an Indian residential school survivor, and she had 14 kids, and and raised them mostly on her own, and did so with big love, and regardless, of what she survived in the Indian residential school, she carried a lot of the medicines and transferred that, and she often would, let me see, she would feel as though she'd have to hide that too, a lot of times, to pass it on. But it's another example and evidence that the epistemicide's not complete, the genocide's not complete. Because one of the impacts of, certainly of the Indian residential school system was one of the impacts was the dispossession of Indigenous love knowledge, like how to love when children were ripped from their families, and dispossessed of how to feel love, how to express love. And somewhere within that process, and that horrific process, many families were able to pass still on, that Indigenous knowledge love transfer. And so, and my kids, who are pictured here with my youngest, my baby, their dad went to day school, and both of their grandparents went to Indian residential school. So I'm just showing you some empirical evidence of how the genocide is not complete and the epistemicide is not complete. And so the honored and thriving, my mom, who was back home in the Penobscot Nation, back east in the Wabanaki Confederacy, for my tribe, was one of the eldest council members at this time that this eagle was found with a broken leg, and the community and the Natural Resources Department helped to get this eagle doctored, and my mom was asked to sort of toss the eagle into its first flight, the baby eagle. And she was quite nervous about doing this. And she's a woman of prayer, she prays lots. And, the eagle took off and had a real awesome flight. And so that sort of brings me back to, the significance and the reminder that women are sacred, and that we need to be reminded that women are sacred, and that we have it within us to heal And that's significant. And I pray and hope that we all, as Indigenous women, are able to arrive at that, and to really let that resonate. And so my last picture is Jibonog. In my language, that means red hope, and that's the name of my baby. And it also means east in my language. So, I'm sorry for such a rushed, through me just sort of blazing over, all of these really critically important topics. But I appreciate the time to be able to talk about it, and I hope and encourage everyone to check out the report, of which I have great reverence for, and the commissioners and all of the individuals and Indigenous women that were part of developing this brilliant piece of work and contribution to Canadian society. Wuli Wani, thank you very much.